So now we know that both hemispheres are important when it comes to language learning, because language processing as well as phonological elements, they are to be understood well to be a good language learner. Let us try to understand how other parts of brain they are helping us. For example, the motor cortex, which is helping us in speaking. The cortical motor area includes four main motor areas: the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the Broca's area, and the frontal eye field. If you look at this picture, then we can see that where these areas are located. This part is the Broca's area. This is the frontal eye field. This is the somatic motor association area, and this is the primary motor cortex area. These areas which are present in the frontal lobe, they are very important for the speaking part of the language, and these areas, they are helping us to think of the words to convey the idea or message, formulate them into sentences according to the grammatical rules, and using lungs, vocal cords and mouth etc. to produce sound. Regions in your frontal, temporal and parietal lobes formulate what you want to say, and motor cortex in the frontal lobe enables us to speak the words. Let us try to revise where these areas of brain are present. This part of the brain which is lying in the front is called as the frontal area, and the area which is lying behind the ear portion, that is the temporal area. Area lying behind frontal region is the parietal lobe. So these three areas, they are very important for when we are speaking the language. And this is the occipital lobe, which is helpful when we are seeing a word or reading a word. Now in the frontal lobe, there is this area present which is shown in dark color, that is the motor cortex region. Motor cortex region has the area which help us to speak, because this area is controlling motor activities, and specific regions of this area are allocated to throat, lips and such like area from where we can show some motor activity. Next important area is primary auditory cortex, which is present in the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is that lobe which is present just behind the ear. I hope you all remember that our cerebral cortex, it has 4 lobes, and this lobe which is present just behind the ear part, that is called as the temporal lobe. In temporal lobe, there is an area which is called as primary auditory cortex. This area is mainly responsible for understanding the speech. This area is organized so that it responds to neighboring frequencies in the other cells of the cortex, and through this area we can identify pitch and loudness of sound. On the function level, decoding a language begins in the ear, where the incoming sounds are summed in the auditory nerve as an electrical signal and delivered to the auditory cortex, where the neurons extract auditory objects from that signal. So that means that when a learner is listening to some speech or some word being spoken, then that stimulus is picked up by the ear, which through auditory nerve is taken to the auditory cortex part of the brain, and these stimuluses, they move in the form of electrical signals, and auditory cortex is the part which can understand electrical signal and interpret it, and that is how we get to hear the sound. So that means that three parts are very important, that is the ear, which help us to hear, and the auditory nerve, which is taking the stimulus from ear to auditory cortex, and third, the auditory cortex, which is responsible for understanding the electrical impulses and converting them into sensory impulse. And this part of the brain is helping us to understand what we are hearing. When we get to understand what we are hearing, that is called as decoding of a language. Now, out of this, if a learner is not able to hear, that means he has lost the hearing capacity, or there is some problem with his ears. Because of that, ears are not able to pick up the auditory stimuluses, or there is some problem in the auditory nerve because of which stimuluses they are not taken to the brain. Even if everything is perfectly alright with the brain or the auditory cortex, even then such a learner will suffer a decline in spoken language. That means that speaking of language is depending upon hearing, and auditory cortex is responsible for decoding. So that is why in the previous part of the lesson also we studied that it is important that the learner gets to listen, because listening is going to initiate the next learning milestone, that is speaking. Similarly, there is another area, that is optic nerve and visual cortex, which is responsible for seeing the word, or when we are receiving the stimulus in the form of visual stimulus, because we can read the words also, or the written language can also be understood. That happens through the optic nerve and visual cortex, and maybe by the sensory cortex and auditory cortex. So there are two ways by which we can perceive the word. We can either see it or we can hear it. When we read a word, then the optic nerve, that is the nerve which is starting from our eyes, and the nerve bundle delivers signals from the eyes to the visual cortex. Visual cortex is the part of the brain. So that means when we are looking at some word, then optic nerve, it picks up the stimulus and delivers the signal through visual cortex to the part of the brain where this stimulus will be interpreted. And in some cases, if the learner is blind, then he can use the sensory cortex also to perceive the sensation by touching. Or we can listen to the word, and in that case auditory cortex will be used. So that means that visual cortex, sensory cortex and auditory cortex, they help us in receiving the information about the word or about the language, and these parts, they help us to understand the word. If you look at this picture, then we will be able to see where these areas are located. Now here you see that this is the area which is the auditory cortex, where the auditory stimulus is understood, and this area is visual cortex where the written word is understood, and this is the sensory cortex where the sensory impulses are received and understood. For example, if someone is blind, then he will be using this area more, and when we are hearing a word, then we are using this area more, and if we are looking at the text, then we are using this area. So this is how we can perceive a language in written form as well as in auditory form. Another part of the brain which is very important, that is the temporal gyrus. Gyrus word means the elevations or ridges which are formed in the brain. Temporal gyrus means the gyrus which is present in the temporal region. For the native speaker, the superior temporal gyrus is more activated and is responsible for automated processing of lexical retrieval and build of phrase structure. Now, if you look at this picture, then we will be able to see the location of temporal gyrus. This is the front part, this is the back side of the brain, and this is the part near the ear, that is the temporal lobe. So, in this you can see that there are two gyri, one which is present on the upper side, which is the superior temporal gyrus, and one which is on the lower side, which is the inferior temporal gyrus. So, these two gyrus, they have distinguished roles when we are learning language as a native speaker or as a second language learner. In case of native speaker, the superior temporal gyrus is activated and it is responsible for automated processing. Automated processing means that no conscious effort is required for this, of lexical retrieval and building of phrase structure. So, as we studied in the previous part of the same lesson, that for native speaker, language speaking is not a conscious effort because they learn it from the interaction with the environment or through the social interaction, and they learn it subconsciously. Whereas in case of second language learner, the inferior frontal gyrus is activated, which is used to decode and identify the meaning of words and sentences of the foreign language. As we studied that for the second language learner, language learning is more of a conscious effort and more of a knowledge based effort, and for that inferior frontal gyrus is activated. So, that means that different parts of the temporal lobe are responsible for making us learn native language and second language. Angular gyrus, which is located in parietal lobe, is responsible for several language processes, including number processing and spatial recognition and attention. The role of angular gyrus in the languages is that if there are some lesions or some damage in the angular gyrus, then it can lead to many symptoms which are termed as Alexia or Agraphia. Alexia is a situation in which there is partial or complete loss of ability to read. The learner is not able to read normally, and in some cases it is almost impossible for him to read, or it is very slow, and comprehension is also impaired. Whereas in case of agraphia, that is a disorder in which there is loss of ability to communicate through writing, either due to some form of motor dysfunctioning or inability to spell. So, because these abilities are also related to language learning, so that is why angular gyrus is also a very important part. Then next comes morphology and size of auditory cortex can predict phonetic learning capacity, while the connection between auditory cortex and specific parietal regions can inform us about the speech sound capability. This means that if auditory cortex is very well developed, then phonetic learning capacity will be more. Phonetic learning capacity means how to produce sound or speak when speaker has no prior knowledge of language, and it helps him to speak and pronounce the words correctly. So, if auditory cortex is well developed, then phonetic ability will be more. Similarly, when the connection between auditory cortex and parietal region are strong, and these are very well developed connections, then there will be speech sound capability. So, if these connections are not very well developed, then speech sound disorder may occur, and in that case the learner will have trouble saying certain sounds and words which he is expected to learn by his age. A child with articulation disorder has problem making certain sounds in the right way. Children with speech sound disorder have difficulty forming speech sound, articulating individual words, and they are not understood properly, and they are not able to modulate their speech, or they may stutter or lisp. So, these are some of the areas of the brain which are very closely linked with the language learning. If we talk about other parts of the brain, they are equally important because memorization and retrieval of memory is very important in learning vocabulary, and similarly emotional development is important to make the language rich, and using facial expressions it will make the language more expressive. So, that is how that all parts of the brain are very important for learning the language properly.